Good morning, and welcome to another edition of the St. Luther Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Review for Sunday, February 27, 2022. We are still in our winter quarter for the year 2021 and 22. As a matter of fact, this is the last lesson in that series, and we know that in this particular quarter, we've been talking about God's justice throughout. And now we're in Unit 3, Justice and Adversity. And today's lesson comes from Job, chapter 42. Chapter 42, verses 1 through 6, and verses 10 through 17. And our devotional reading comes from Zechariah chapter 7, verses 8 through 14. And our background scripture is the entire chapter 42 of the book of Job. Our adult topic for today is hope for justice. And the youth topic is humble obedience. And the children's topic is the one in charge. And we know that the book of Job is one of the ones that lots of people are familiar with. And if you're not careful, what you would think is that the book of Job is one that explains why bad things happen to good people. But that's not the key point in the book of Job. The key point is our understanding of the awesomeness of God and how wise he is. And we know that in the book of Job, which says that Job was a perfect and an upright man who lived in Uz, and he was a prosperous man. He was a perfect and upright man who feared God and hated evil. And we know that Job was tested because one day when the sons of God came to meet with him, Satan came also. And God asked him a question. Where you been? More or less, what you been up to? And he said, I've been walking up and down on the earth, back and forth. And Job, God didn't ask him what he was trying to do, because I'm sure God already understood what he was trying to do, seeking whom he might devour, because his intent was to kill, steal, and destroy. So God didn't ask him what he was doing, but he just asked him a question. Have you considered my servant Job? And Satan went on to explain that Job was a blessed man, that he had everything that he needed, and that God had a hedge around him. And so, but he told him if you remove that hedge from around him, that I will make him curse you to your face. And so that was a dare. And God told him, in essence, I will give you permission to do anything that you want to do to him, only do not touch his soul. Do not take his life. And from that point on, Satan proceeded to do just that. So you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who suffered more adversity than Job in such a short period of time. Job lost everything that he owned. He lost his possessions. He lost his 10 children. And he was stricken with boils on his body from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. Even his wife questioned his integrity and suggested or said that he should curse God and die. But in all of this, Job did not sin, nor did he charge God foolishly. Instead, he said, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's chapter 1, verses 21 and 22. And I would be remiss and certainly unable to adequately discuss today's lesson without talking about Job's three friends. You know, Job had three friends who visited him when they found out about his illness. Those three friends sat there and they looked at him for 7 days before they uttered a word. But then when they began to speak, they did so in an accusatory way. And they were also spoke with a lack of compassion. We know that when we visit someone who's ill, normally what we try to do is to encourage them. But what Job's friends did was that they, based on their own intellect, had surmised that the reason why Job was suffering was because he had committed sin. And they were not compassionate with him at all in how they discussed that with him. Now, no doubt, they thought that they were doing the right thing. But one thing that we need to understand is that when we try to go out and speak for God, we need to make sure that he's the one who sent us. And no doubt, God had not sent them to Job, because if he had, they would not have gone in the manner that they went. And they would have not tried to treat Job as they did, with the lack of compassion that they did. They went based on what their understanding was. They understood that if you were suffering, it was because of sin. And if you were doing well, if you were prospering, it was because you were doing as God had wanted you to do. So, but they were wrong. They were wrong, and this was based on their intellect. But if you read the book of Job, you notice that much of the book has to do with the dialogue back and forth between Job and his friends. Them accusing him of having committed a sin, and telling him what he needed to do was to go to God and admit that he had committed sin, and asking for forgiveness. But then Job knew that he had not committed any sin. So what Job wanted vindication. Job at a various point, after having gone through dialogue after dialogue with his three friends, Job was beginning to become frustrated, and he wanted God to come to him and explain why these things was happening to him. And this went on for a long period of time. But then finally, along about chapter 38, God spoke to Job in a whirlwind. And it was not what Job expected. No doubt Job expected a concise answer as to why he was going through the things that he was having to suffer. But what God did was to give Job an explanation of who he is. And he started out by asking him certain questions. And one of those questions was, where were you when I formed the earth? Where were you when I hung the stars and the moon in the sky? And he went on to describe just how awesome he is and what he had done, to let Job know just how awesome he is and how wise he is. So that brings us down to where our lesson begins today. And that is chapter 42, verses 1 through 6. Is the first outline. And that outline is Job responds to the Lord. And if you look at these particular scriptures, you see then it said, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. And then what he went on to do was to repeat what God had told him. He said, who in chapter 38, he said, who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me to know. So in other words, God asked him, who are you to be thinking that you can tell me what I should do? And Job listened to what God had to say. He learned when God was talking to him. And that much is obvious, because he said that I have uttered things that I understood not, things too wonderful for me to know. So we need to understand that God's ways are not our ways, and God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and his thoughts are much higher than ours. So we can't assume that we understand or we know the mind of God. He said, hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare unto thou unto me. So God told him that, look, I'm going to speak, and I will demand of you to declare unto me. So he was telling him, you need to gird up your loins, get ready, and be ready to speak to me, because I'm going to ask you these questions, and you, since you're so smart, you need to be able to answer. And then he went on to say, Job went on to say in verse 5, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eyes see thee. That's the way we are. Before we have a personal relationship with God, what happens to us is that we know of him, but we really don't know him. And in order to get to know God, we need to get to know God's word, because God is what? His word. And so what Job did, as God went on to explain to him all that he had done, all his awesome works, that he knows everything, that he understands everything, that he is the one who created everything. Job listened to that, and Job learned. And Job understood that he knew of God, but he didn't really have a relationship with him. So then, as we move on, those verses between verses 6 and 10 are those verses where God told one of Job's friends that he was angry with them, and that what they needed to do was to have a burnt offering, and they need to go to Job and ask Job what to pray for them. And Job, God asked Job to pray for his friends, and Job did. Job was obedient. And this leads us into verses 10, 11, and 12. The Lord restores Job. Job was obedient. So it says in verse 10, and the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friend. Also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came there unto him all his brethren and his sisters, and all they that had been his acquaintance before, and they did eat bread with him in his house. They bemoaned him and comforted him over all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. Every man also gave him a piece of money, and every one an earring of gold. And it says in verse 12, so the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels and 1,000 yoke of oxen and 1,000 she-asses. So in other words, what happened is God restored Job to his former state. Even his family, his brothers and sisters, his siblings, did not come to visit him when he was ill. But when God restored him, they returned. And because Job had missed them, he had missed his relationship with his family. So God restored all that to him. And also he blessed him with more than he had in the beginning. You know, Job was a rich man and he had lots of animals before, but then God gave him more than he had before. So only God can restore us. I see sometime when folk, I guess we call it backslide. They backslide and they come back and they restore their membership to the church. Well, that's fine. We accept them. But God is the only one who can truly restore us to a rightful relationship with him. Finally, if we look at verses 13 through 17, we see that Job received double from the Lord. And it says in verse 13 and thereafter, he had also 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he called the name of the first Jemima, and the name of the second Kizah, and the name of the third Karen Happa. And in all the land were no women found so fair as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brethren. After this lived Job 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So Job died being an old man, being old and full of days. So in other words, Job had 10 children at first, and those children were killed. They said the 4 winds struck the corners of the building that they were in, and the building collapsed on them, killing all 10 of them. But what God did was he gave him 10 more children. And then it went on to say something about his daughters that he didn't say about the first daughters that he had. He said that none were as fair as the ones that he had this time. And he gave them an inheritance just like he gave his son. Now, we know that back in that time, it was not customary that the daughters would get an inheritance, but the inheritance would go to the sons because that was the way to maintain wealth in the family. I thought about that thing, and I wondered what's important. You know, we talk about justice. Everything that we talked about over the last 3 months was about justice. And God's justice demands that we treat each other right. We treat each other equally. We treat each other just. So it's not unusual then that God would treat his daughters just as he did his sons. But the point that I would leave us with today is that when we look at this, we're tempted to say that God restored everything that Job had lost. It's true that God replaced everything that Job had lost, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a restoration. I would call it a new beginning, because God gave Job everything that he gave him was something different. It wasn't the same. He didn't get the same children back. And some people might say, well, they were killed. He couldn't replace it. He couldn't bring them back. But yes, he could have. God could have if he had wanted to. He could have brought the same ones back, but he didn't. He brought them different. He brought them more. So rather than say that Job, that everything was restored, I'd like to say that everything was replaced. And the most important thing that was replaced was that Job ended up in a better place than where he started out, because Job did not know God. He knew of God. But by the end, when after he had gone through everything that he went through, he knew God. He knew God for himself, and he had a relationship with God. And that's what we need to understand, is that adversity is going to come. And when adversity comes, we need to understand that we need to remain faithful to God. Because that's what we need. And we need to have an understanding that if God brings us through one adversity, he will bring us through another. We need to have the same faith that was demonstrated by the Hebrew boys. When they told the king, they said, "Oh, king, I know that God will deliver us from this furnace. But even if he doesn't, he's able." And that's the way we need to think. That's the way our faith needs to be. That's our lesson for today. Today's lesson, serving a just God. And from the unit, justice and adversity. God gives justice even during times of adversity. Thank you, and have a great day.